Hi everyone, this is my review of Norman Conquests from GMT Games. This is part of the Men of Iron series and this is volume number 5. Now, in full transparency, I have not played any of the prior Men of Iron games. More's the pity, I may add, because this game I like a lot. And in this review, I'm going to talk about some of the components, show some of the gameplay examples, talk about some of the mechanics, and I will talk about who I think this is for and what I like about the game, so you can judge and decide for yourself if it's a game for you. It is the tagline is Conflicts of the Normans and their successors 1053 to 1265. We have a look at the back of the box. We've got our list of our game components, and I'll show some of the game components that you get in the game. In terms of solitaire suitability, high, and I would agree with that. I've played all the scenarios in the battle book solo. I've got a video, I'm pretty sure, for every single one, and I've played them all solo, and the game solos very well. It does not have a bot. You're not playing against the game, you're having to play two-handed. Basically means you're playing both the two sides to the best that you can, and complexity is 4 out of 9. I also agree with this. I think it's definitely what I would consider a medium complexity, but it's the lower end of medium complexity, if that makes any sense. And we get a bit of blurb and we get a bit of description of the scenarios, and I'm going to talk about the scenarios. One of the things I do like about the game is both the number of scenarios that you get, but also the different time periods that the scenarios cover. The last thing I want to say about the game, I really do like the cover art. I really like the cover art. It's very evocative. It's nice. It's really well done, etc. So what we'll do now is we will have a look at the rulebook. So the rulebook itself, 28 pages, of which several pages are extended. Sequence of play, there's a page of index, there's pages of special rules. I'm going to go out and say this is about 20 pages of rules, actual rules of the game. Full colour, it's a normal GMT sort of paper stock. It's nicely laid out. There are lots of references to the previous games in this series. So not everything is specific to this game, as you would expect. It's got an interesting sequence of play because of the activations. It doesn't play in turns, basically. You activate a group of counters, and you do the things with those, and then if you want to, you can activate another group of counters. You have to roll dice to see if that works out, or the opposing player can take that away from you, and then you can counter that. It's quite an interesting mechanic. It's one of the things I like about the game. Gives the game great flavour, but it's not that traditional I go, you go, we play a number of turns. Just simply doesn't work that way. And that I think is one of the things I really enjoyed about the game. The fact it's not like that. Not that I dislike normal you go, I go turn-based games either, for that matter. And that is a mechanic. When I read through, I went, I don't know if I completely understand that. Got it onto the table and then went, oh, this makes perfect sense. This is really good. It's definitely a game for me that made more sense. Some games I can read the rule book and go, I understand exactly how this game works. There are some games where I go, I think I do, get it on the table and go, oh yeah, that perfect. Makes loads of sense now. This is that. All the rules are very well written. Movement works as you would expect. Facing works as you would expect. Missile fire, so predominantly archery in this game. There are some crossbow units later in some of the later scenarios, and there's some longbow as well. Works as you would expect. Shot combat I'll talk more about when we look at one of the player aids, because there's lots of interesting things about the combat that I really enjoyed. And the same with the charging as well. Some games, for some inexplicable reason, I always find the charging mechanics quite convoluted, whereas in this game they are very elegantly distilled into a focus, which I really liked, which makes them very playable but also quite flavoursome, and very thematic. Um, there are optional rules, and this is examples here. Sometimes I played with these, sometimes I didn't. There are rallying rules. Again, rallying, as you'd expect, you can rally your troops that have been broken. If you come to this game from, no doubt, if you come to this game from the Men of Iron series, you will probably be very familiar, and it works exactly the same as the other Men of Iron games. I don't know because I haven't played those, unfortunately. But if you've come to this from other war games, and you've never played a game in this series like me, it all makes a lot of sense, and it's all familiar, but with enough novel twists and interesting components from a game mechanics point of view. The shield wall rules are really cool. It's really thematic. It's an interesting. It makes it very interesting decision making for both the defenders as to when you come out of a shield wall, and for the attackers as to when to attack. There are optional rules for engage, which again sometimes used, sometimes didn't, and a full index. The one thing I really do like about this rule book, I should hasten to add here, is that during play there are always times when I would refer to the rule book, and I found finding those questions I had very, very easy to find in the rule book and incredibly well written. I can't think of a single example where I read the rule and went, what? Am I reading that right? That makes no sense. Am I misinterpreting it? I don't understand. I never found that with this rule book. Found everything very, very carefully written. I think it's an excellent rule book. I really do. Excellent job. Excellent work for both the game designer and the people involved. And there are some changes from the original edition of the games from the series. So if you've come to this game and you want to play with these rules for the prior games in the series, you can do. You do, like me, you absolutely, I'm absolutely clear, you do not need to have played any of the games in the Men of Iron game series to play this and enjoy this. Because I haven't, and I actually love this game. So there you go. So next we'll have a look at the battle book, which is basically the scenarios. So this is the second book you get in the game, and it's basically the scenarios that you're going to be playing through, all the battles. It's exactly the same, full colour, about 24 pages, which includes another extended example of play. The format for the scenarios is pretty much identical for the different scenarios, or the different battles. I should keep calling them rather than scenarios. You get a bit of background about the history. You get your deployment, so it's good to sort out your counters by their type. So, for example, the Papal Army, but also by the sort of groupings, we'll call them here. And one of the good things again with this rulebook is they give you a map, example, and where to place the counters on the setup, which makes the setup very easy and quick. It removes any ambiguity about the game setup. It will give any examples about any special rules. So if you can use shield walls in this scenario, and most of the scenarios, well, half of them you can, half of them you can't, we'll say. One of the other interesting things about the game is the flight levels, which I've talked about in some of the playthrough or the ARs I've done of the game. Basically, the two sides are quite asymmetrical in the sense that one side will effectively surrender, call it a day, leave the battlefield, whatever you want to call, get defeat, compared to the other. And that's mechanic of that is the flight points. Basically, when you lose a counter, it's eliminated or removed from play, you gain a flight point or two, or three, or five, depending on what type of counter it is. When you hit a certain threshold, it's over, your side is defeated. It's not an uncommon mechanic in war games, plenty of other games I've got that use that mechanic. But then what's interesting, like a lot of other games, that level is different between the two sides. One of the interesting things of this game, because it's so historically thematic, is the battle book does this. It says this scenario will favour one side compared to the other. So which is interesting. Fulford, for example, in Yorkshire, which is between the Norwegians and the Saxons, the Norwegian side is favoured in this battle. So when you're setting the game up and you're playing through the game, when you're playing through solo like me, or you're playing 2-player, you know one side's going to probably is more chance of winning. That's not to say the other side can't win. That's not absolutely not the case. But it's an interesting element of this historical game. One of the things I really do like about the game is, and I talked about this in my show sort of initially, was the amount, both the amount of battles scenarios you get, but also the different history that they cover. So, for example, Fulford is 1066 in England. Stamford Bridge is also 1066 in England. Hastings the same, 1066. But if we look at this scenario here, for example, it's in France and it's in 1106. So there's a wider variety, and Lewis is 1264, for example. And you can see they all follow this same sort of format. There are some special rules on Eversham, which I just recently played, 1265. That's the game that I've got currently set up on the table that I've just finished playing. So there's a range of different time periods. There's a range of different special rules, not too many. It's a good amount, actually, I found. And we'll have a look at the maps. But the other thing that's really good, certainly good to know about this game, is the time it takes to play through the battles is quite, in wargaming sense, quite short. And again, it gives you an indication. So, Eversham, 1.5 hours, right? And that is the true of the vast majority of the battle scenarios. Normally an hour or two, hour and a half or two. Lewis is 2 hours. What's Hastings? What did they say Hastings was? Just over 2 hours for Hastings. Now, broadly, having played them all, I would agree with that. Broadly, you can comfortably play, if you can dedicate a couple of hours, you can play through a battle in an evening. I played a lot of them over a couple of evenings because of other things going on in my life, and that worked just absolutely dandy. But it's a fairly short scenario type for wargaming reference game, which is great. Again, everything's nicely laid out. Everything's very clear. I never had any issues with the setup. I never had any issues understanding the objective of the battle, of the scenario. Never had any issues with any of the special rules pertaining to that scenario. Everything is very clear. It's a great, just a couple of paragraphs on the historical background. If you're unfamiliar with some of the history of some of these battles, and there's a couple in here that I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And I went and, after playing through the game, went away and I did a bit of reading, and I was like, oh, it's really a good sort of stepping off point to learn more about the history. If you're so inclined, you don't need to know anything about this historic period or this history of the battle, to enjoy and play the game. It just adds a flavour to it if you are of that persuasion, which I am. So yeah, an excellent scenario book. You also get a nice extended example of play, a sequence of play here on the back cover as well, which I used as a play aid whilst playing. And speaking of player aids, that's a good segue, isn't it? Let's have a look at the main player aid you will be using in the game. Now, it's worth mentioning you get 2 of these player aids, one for both player. And this is the only player aid that you will be using. Like I said, I use the back of the battle book as well. This is the one you're going to be using nearly all the time. And to be honest with you, for the most part, a lot of this I was able to memorize, and I'm not always great at doing that. And I was able to do it. So the actual referring to it is a low, I would say, especially during once you've played the game once or twice, for example. One of the key parts of this player aid is this weapon system matrix. Basically, it's a D10 game. You roll a dice, and that result is modified depending on who you are attacking and who you are that is doing the attacking. So if we have a pike unit here, for example, and you are attacking another pike unit, it's 0. And you can see the pattern there, 0, 0, 0, 0. So if one type of counter is attacking the same type of counter, it's 0, right? However, if you are attacking a different type of counter, then it's either going to be a plus or a minus. And the vast majority, let's say, are minus. So if you've got let's use a pike, for example, and you are attacking a mounted men at arms, it's a -1. So when you roll your dice, you get an 8, you take -1 off that result, you get a 7. Really simple, right? One of the things, and it is interesting, it's a really simple mechanic, and it's I've sort of very simplified it, and you can sort of go through and analyze the table. When you actually play the game, it's a really elegant and distilled mechanic that adds a lot of flavour to the combat, because there are often different types of troops involved in close proximity fighting, vicious fighting, bloody fighting, etc, etc. The other thing I like as well, okay, it's a really simple mechanic. If you have a leader with your unit and it suffers any kind of bad thing happening to you, roll dice to see if the leader is a casualty. And it's amazing how many times, and again on the D10, if you get a 7 or more, they die. And it's amazing how many times that happened. And it adds almost at exactly the wrong time in the game, one of your leaders dies. This section here talks about the terrain. We'll have a look at the map. So, to be honest with you, there's not a lot of terrain types. There really, really isn't. And even if they're on the map, often they don't even involve actually in the game when the battles, certainly the ones that I played. So you don't need to worry too much about the terrain. What is good is that there's a terrain chart per battle, which is also per map, because there's no battles that take place on 2 maps, I can't recall. There are some nuances between some of them here. So it's just very clear. It's very straightforward, to be honest with you. And then at the back here, we have our other main combat tables. So often, because I've got 2 copies, so you get 2 in the game. If I'm playing solo, I have 1 here like this, and then I have the other next to my board like this. And again, to be honest with you, sort of some of this you could memorize. To be honest, the fire results. So you've got a unit of archers. They shoot at another unit, regardless of what they are, and you look to see how far the range is. There may be a modifier, and then there's you roll the dice and you see what you get. There's a few modifiers that you can have, and archers overall are pretty effective, to be honest. If you're firing at a normal target on foot, so it's in normal order, it's not been disordered, you only need a 5 or more to make it into disordered. So on a D10, 10 counts as 0 in this game. So the odds are slightly against you, but only very slightly. But if you're next to them, so in their range is only 1 hex, you get a +1. Crossbows especially get a +2 as do longbows. And there's nuances between the different types. So fire combat is very straightforward. Shock combat, so melee combat, again, you roll a dice. There are some modifiers all listed here. There is not too many. And you see what result you get depending if the counter is normal or disordered. I'll show that when we have a look at the game in progress, or the game I've just finished with a map in place. So very well laid out, very useful. You don't need a lot of player aids. You will find, or I found, like I said, a couple of games in, I'd got most of it in my head, and they sat there next to me just to remind me, or if I wanted to double check something. But again, very well done. It's not a game where there's a huge amount of chrome that impacts the normal gameplay, let's call it. So, But there's enough in here, I felt, over and over again. For me, it's a very thematic game. And there's enough in the core mechanics. It doesn't need all that chrome, for me, anyway. So, yeah, great. This was nicely done. Now, the maps, as you can see here, they are very, be honest, basic. They're very functional. And it's part of the nature of the battles themselves. You know, they often took place in fields, for example. And this is Stamford Bridge. It's just an example. You do get each of the scenarios has its own specific map. And we'll have a look at the table in a minute where I've got the last bits of a battle set up. But as you can see, it's just sparse. It's just a flat colour. It's not. It's very readable. It's very functional. That's the key word I'm going to keep using. That's all it is. I feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity, to be honest. But I suspect that this is the sort of GMT style maps that have been in all of the games in this series, and therefore it probably suits this game series to have the similar sort of style. If we turn it over, for example, it's just completely blank. There's just nothing. And if we open, they are double-sided. This is full FUD. Again, for example, it's just it is what it is, as they say. But I feel like it's probably a bit of like I said, a bit of a missed opportunity. It would be really great to have a more rich, interesting map. The counters, however, I think are really, really nice. I'm not saying I don't like the maps. They just are functional. You know, very readable, but very, very, very functional. So if you love gorgeous artistry on the maps, this not in this game. But for all that, it makes the game very playable, which is of help. Actually, the game I've got set up on the board, on the table at the minute, is probably got the most interesting of all the maps. So let's have a look at that next. So this is Evesham battle that I've just finished playing. There's a separate video about that on my channel, but I just want to show the map. So in this example, the map's slightly bigger. So a lot of the battles in this game are what I would call half map. So basically this sort of, you just can't see my hand slightly off camera, but a bit slightly bigger than this sort of size. So in terms of footprint, there are lots of battles in this game. The vast majority are very small footprint games. If you're familiar with GMT games, they are what I would class as a half map size map. It basically means your big printout of your map, is only half of it you're actually going to be using, and you often get two maps on one. This is an exception to that. There are a couple of the battles. This is one of them where it's the full map, but even so, the actual hexagons finish there about halfway through the last sort of quarter, and then there's some player aid stuff on the side. Actually, I think it's terrain, map key. But again, you can see the artwork of the map. Again, it's functional. This is one of the more interesting maps, as I said, this because this is a big hill for this particular battle, and we've got rivers and a little bit of dwellings here in Evesham itself. But again, it's just very, very functional. What I'll do next, I'm just going to move the camera and we'll have a look at some of the counters, because I think the counters are really nicely done. So let's have a look at some counters. So as you can see, here we've got some counters laid out. The counters are very clean, very readable. They don't have a huge amount of information on them, but there are a couple of things that are worth calling out. We have our movement points on the bottom right of the counters. Then we have our combat modifiers. So remember I said you roll a d10, you may be adding or detracting numbers to get your final results. If you're in combat with an archer, let's use this example here. Let's say those two, you're playing the pike, you roll a d10, you get 6, you'd add the +2 from the counter there onto that number. Very simple, very straightforward. These are leaders, and you can see what they've done is they've done different artwork for the different sides. So that's an archer, that's an archer, that's an archer, and they've all got different pieces of artwork which are very nice. The same with the horse, for example. And we've got, they're the same type of counter, these two. But we've got unique pieces of artwork, which is very thematic and very nicely done. Same with the pike. These are, that's a pike, and that's a pike there, as is that one. And again, they're all slightly different and very nicely done indeed. The other thing that's worth calling out, the coloured bar shows the sort of the group, we'll call them, that they belong to, the formation, if you will. The battle is what the game calls them. So they're both yellow, both blue, both green. That's a yellow one, and that's a different colour there, sort of off purple or something. Do you know what I mean? Gameplay counters, again, very readable, very nicely done. They look great on the board. That's what I would describe. All the counters punch very nicely. You can trim them or clip them if you desire, and they look really nice. They look very, again, very thematic, very easy to read. I wear reading glasses when I'm playing games, and I had no problems with reading any of the information on the counters themselves. The leaders have more information, but again, once you've played through a couple of games, you're referring to it very casually, very infrequently. When I talked about the variety of scenarios, there's also a variety of different sides, or we'll call them for the sake of argument. So we've got Saxons, Normans, they're the baronials that I've just been playing with, they're the royalists, and papal there. And each battle, it will tell you which counters to place on the battlefield. I think in every single case, you're just using two sides. So in the game I've got set up at the minute, it was the royalists, these sort of red against the baronials, it's sort of grey. And if you watch my AARs of all the battles that I've done, you can get a sense of the layout of the counters on the maps, because I show at the beginning of the video the sort of the default setup that you can take part in. But their counters are absolutely wonderful. It's one of the things I like. One of the things I really like about their game is that attention to detail in the counters. They look thematic. They're easy to read. They look great on the board. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the combat at its most simple form, really, just to give you an idea of how the game works. And combat is melee combat and missile combat is one of the key mechanics of the game. Not surprisingly, based on the battles that it covers. So in this example here, let's suppose you're playing this grey counter here, baronial force, and you're wishing to perform shock combat on this counter here. The game does come with some very handy shock combat counters, so you could put these all on your counters, and as you then do the shock combat, it makes it a little bit easier for you. You don't have to. If you can remember, then great. I did on some of the larger battles, especially when combat's getting quite involving with lots of different counters. So here, as I described earlier, this is a pike versus pike. You're the attacker, the defender. The attacker here, pike, defending, pike, 0. So it's a 0 modifier. So you roll the d10, and let's suppose, well, say we get 7, right? Now in this instance here, this counter here has a +1. So that 7 then becomes an 8. Example there. And if we go to our results table here, and then we look here, this is a normal counter. Now on the flip side of the counters, they are in their disordered state, which handily has a big D for disordered on the back. But in this instance here, it's in a normal condition. We've got our adjusted dice roll, and there are a bunch of modifiers there, for example. So we've done the weapons systems matrix, the defender's shock dice roll modifier, strength advantage. If, let's say, I had 2 counters, which is often the way, 2 counters here attacking this one, I'd get another +1 because I have a second counter. So you're not having to add up the strength points against the defensive points or anything like that. It's simply as simple as that. And let's suppose in this example here, we get on 8 and the defender is disordered and retreats 1 hex. So then the defender, you'd flip the counter over, shows the disordered, and you can see straight away that +1 then becomes, when they're disordered, becomes a +2. And let's say retreat. And let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that in the next activation, it's not turns, next activation of this grouping here, this counter attacks again. And let's say, for example, again, I get a 7. Let's keep it consistent. I add the +2, it makes the 9. And then on the table here, I don't use this column, I use the disordered column. And I can see at a 9, defender eliminated. Continue the attack. So that would be taken off the board. This would then add to the opponent's, or to that side's flight point limit, or current flight point, sorry I should say. And that's worth 2 points on their flight. So they would add +2. And then when they reach that threshold, that the Royalist army is defeated. That counter would move into the hex that it vacated. I can't remember which one was that one, I think. And then I get my continued attack with a -1. And let's suppose in that example, there's another pike unit that's already disordered. There, I can continue, I can do another attack with a -1 modifier. It's, in a nutshell, it's as straightforward as that. There are subtleties, so there are a bunch more modifiers. So if you've got a leader with your counter, that can add a bonus. There are, if the defender is retired, that gives you a bonus, etc. There are a bunch more levels of modifier, but for the most part, most of the combat is as straightforward and as simple as that. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the continuation. So, as I described earlier, the game doesn't take place in turns. It's not like turn 1, then turn 2, then turn 3. Instead, what you have are these activations. I'm just going to use layman terms of your groupings. One of the things that actually I found a little weird when I first went through the rule, they're called battles. And I'm like, but I'm playing a battle. That doesn't make any sense. But don't worry about that. Instead, let's just call them a formation. So here's my formation. They've all got the same colour band on them. In the game, this is just a quick mock-up, you might have 3 times the amount of counters in your formation. If you watch my AARs, you'll be able to see where I talk about that and show that. And let's suppose that I've done something, whatever it is, with these, they've moved, they've done some combat, regardless. Okay? And I think, well, now I want to activate this formation here. I can't activate this one twice in a row. I want to activate this formation. Okay? I would need to roll a dice to see if that's possible. However, the opponent has a number of these seizure counters, and the number and what those counters are depends on the scenario. So it's like a chit pool mechanic, if you're familiar with that idea. You put a number of these into a cup and you pull out the amount the scenario says, or the battle says. It might be 2 or 3 or 4, depends. And these give the opponent the opportunity to seize the ability to activate their groupings instead. So let's say the opponent has, let's find one here. Here we go. Seize opportunity 0 to 7. So they would roll a dice, and if they get the numbers they need, they would have seized the opportunity. And so therefore the opponent would be able to say, oh, I'm going to activate this groupings here. Again, forget the number of counters. Let's just pretend it's like 3-4 times the amount, and they would be able to activate that grouping there. In essence, that's how it works. Now, if you don't want to seize the opportunity, all is not lost. Because like I said, the player, if they've activated this grouping, moved them, combat, they want to activate this grouping to do movement and combat, they have to roll a dice. And if they don't get the required number, then the seizure goes to the opposing side, and they get the free activation. And using that free activation, they can activate one of their groupings. The other thing they can do, and I'll show this as a silly example. Let's suppose that because of combat, some of the on the royalist side here, some of the counters have been retired, and we showed that in combat you can either be retired, or you can be disordered, or you can be removed. Instead, the royalist player can use activation to activate their banner, and retired counters are unretired and able to get back into the game. That's it in a nutshell, in layman terms. I'm not going to go through every nuance of every single particular type of rule. I'd be here for a long time, and they're probably better people explaining the specifics of the game mechanics than I can. But how it works in the game, you are activating your groupings, your units, whatever you want to call them, battles, what the rulebook says, etc. You are doing things with them, then you're going to try and activate more of them, and the opponent will try and take those activations away from you using the seizure counters or depending on the dice roll you get. What this means in reality is you may be able to activate a group, then activate another group, and activate another group. It's not determined how many you will be able to activate in one concurrent string of activations. The opponent will be able to take that away from you, and you'll be able to take it away from them. They'll try and seize activation, you'll be able to counter that, etc., etc. And what it does, in truth, it adds for this really dynamic battle, which basically means you don't know how many of these you're going to be able to activate in turn. What you do know is chances are you'll be able to activate something, and then the opponent will probably do so, and then you'll be able to do so. You may be able to activate two things before they can activate it, so forth and so forth. It's a really engaging mechanic. It's one of the things I love about the game. It adds the level of unpredictability to a game that is, in essence, the combat, as we just saw, it's actually quite straightforward, etc. But it adds that real flavour to the battle and creates a great narrative of the battle. So I'm just going to finish on some concluding thoughts. What do I like about it? Who do I think it's for? What I liked about this game was that you get a lot of content. You get a large number of battles. I think there are about 7 in total. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in total. They all can be played in an evening comfortably, or a couple of evenings at a more leisurely pace. Most of them take an hour and a half to 2 hours to set up and play. The maps, whilst functional and basic, serve their purpose. The counters look great with all the different artwork on all the counters that we've seen. The game mechanics themselves vary from being very straightforward. Combat, cavalry charging, which I didn't show, fundamentally works the same as combat. You can charge, you have to roll to see, depending on who you're attacking, if that charge is successful or if it just turns into normal combat and then normal combat ensues. Missile fire, very straightforward. Movement, etc. Rallying your troops, all very straightforward. The activations, how you can activate different groups in succession, is a wonderful mechanic, one I really, really enjoy. It adds a level of unpredictability and agency to the game. It's not like you're going to sit there, if you're playing 2-player, it's not like you're going to sit there for 15, 20 minutes waiting for the other player to do their thing. No. Instead, you'll be able to interrupt and grab activation. If you're playing solo, that lends itself very well because you don't know. It adds an unpredictability to the solo game when you're playing 2 sides. The rulebook and the battle book are very well written, very well presented. All the graphical language and English language, all the styling, the artisticness of the game, is all of a very high quality. And in fairness, this is not an expensive game. You get, in my opinion, you get a lot of bang for your buck or your pound sterling, depends on where you're from, etc., etc. I certainly, when I first got the game, I played literally battle after battle in one sitting because I enjoyed the game mechanics so much. I played the first 3 battles in one really long evening. Just played each game, set the next game up and played it. Found the mechanics so straightforward and so rewarding, but also with the nuance and the depth. And a lot of that nuance and depth comes through the combat, and it comes through the results of the combat and unpredictable things that are happening. So even in that example I gave, when you defeat a unit, you have to move forwards right into the enemy, more into the enemy depth of the enemy flanks and ranks, and that can have not always the best results, etc. for you. So there's a great dynamic to the battle, which leads to a very strong narrative of the battle. Certainly if you watch all the AARs I've done of these battles, that's one thing that I hope comes across in the gameplay that I've done. Who do I think it's for? If you enjoy the Men of Iron series, it's obvious. This is another great addition. I cannot compare it to the others. What I would say is you get a bunch of very, short-ish battles to play with some nuances to the rules, and I think there are some rules in here that you can apply to your previous games. If you've never played a game of the Men of Iron series, I cannot compare how good this is as a starting point. It would seem to me a great place to start because the battles are short, they don't take a huge amount of space, they don't take a huge amount of time, you get a lot of them. It's a low cost entry point in terms of financial cost and in terms of the complexity of the game into the series. If you are not sure if this game series is for you completely, maybe you've not got a lot of layman knowledge of the Norman conquests, etc., like myself, I found it a great springboard into learning more about the history, more about these particular battles. Some of these battles take place here in the United Kingdom, and I was very unfamiliar with them. So I enjoyed that part of the learning, and of course, war games are great at doing that. So my advice, if you're not sure you're on the shelf, I would give this game a try because I think it has a lot of very interesting mechanics. It creates a very dynamic and fulfilling narrative of what a battle would have taken place. And it's you just get a lot of it. It's not like it's one game. Oh, okay, how much replayability has this? Certainly my AARs, while I was playing it, I was like, oh, maybe I didn't do this right, maybe I should try this, a different tactic the next time. And because you get 7 of those battles, which is a lot in a war game, then you've got a good amount of replayability. Overall, I absolutely love this game. It's totally won me over for the Men of Iron series. I wish I'd bought the Men of Iron tri-pack when I had the opportunity. I didn't. Massive regret. But I do know GMT have more games coming in this series, and I, for one, will definitely pick them up without hesitation. I absolutely enjoyed this game a huge amount. I played every single battle, some of them multiple times, some of them I think 3 or 4 times now, and it will definitely be a firm keeper for me. If you have played the game and you've got any thoughts, please leave a comment in the comment section. I'm always interested in what other people think about the games that I play, and hopefully that was interesting, and thanks for watching as always. Thank you.